Thanks, everyone. Tamara started that round of applause. She does work for me, so that's she's contractually obliged to start applause whenever I say anything reasonable. So she doesn't do it often. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to those online as well. I'm looking at a camera. I don't know if I'm looking at the camera that you're all looking at, but welcome to you online as well. It is absolutely fantastic to have you all here today, especially on a night like this. When you come into Parliament House, and so those of you that are physically here, you come into Gadigal land, which is where this Parliament sits. And so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Sometimes people ask why we do these acknowledgements of country. One of the things I reflect on a lot is that as Australia's oldest parliament, and the one that has been in this location since 1829, we were the source of many of the laws that disenfranchised and otherwise dispossessed Aboriginal people. We were the original place, literally within 20 metres of where you are all sitting, those of you that are physically here today, was the place where those laws were set. As one of the current custodians of this institution, I think it's important that we acknowledge that history, but work to try to make sure that we have a way forward that makes sure the next 200 years is significantly better than the last 200 years of this institution's history. And that's one of the reasons why we acknowledge country at events like this, but one of the reasons why it's particularly important to us as an institution to do so is to make sure that we are part of that future, not just staying on where things have been in the past as well. So thank you all for being here today. You were in the historic Jubilee Room. This was the original parliamentary library in 1901, and we restored it about 8 or 9 years ago. And so there's a little exercise for anyone that gets a little distracted through the course of today that's here in the room. When we replaced the carpet, we went back to the British manufacturer who made the carpet, who's been there for hundreds of years, and that came through. And there's actually a problem with the pattern. When you're looking down there, there is an issue, an inconsistency, a flaw in the thing that covers our floor. So my challenge to you through the course of today is to find that flaw and tell me about it. When we went back to the carpet manufacturer and said, you've made a terrible mistake, they said to us, no, you asked for the exact replica of the carpet we produced for you in 1901. And we said, yes, that's correct. They said, we made this mistake in 1901, and you asked for an exact replication of it. We have replicated it exactly for you. So something for you to look for through the course, but a reflection of this historic room and the work that's happened here. So I'm really pleased to be here to open another parliamentary Unpacked event as part of our series. It's a series of educational programs and talks offered by the New South Wales Parliament and my education and engagement team, who I'd like to thank for their excellent work in pulling not just this event, but the series together. And as a part of our ongoing civics and community engagement program. We try to provide the public with insights into the working of the legislature. And that's particularly, I think, important for today's topic, where we'll be exploring the role of the media in reporting the functions of Parliament, but also consider what responsibility it has to communicate not only the politics of this place, but also educating the community about the functions of this Parliament. We live in a very interesting world at the moment, and just before this session, the panel and I were talking a little bit about this. The Parliament is in some ways an information broker. We produce laws, we produce information about those laws, we produce Hansard records and votes and minutes and who voted for what. And we pride ourselves as being a trusted provider of that information. But what does it mean to be a trusted provider of information in a post-trust world where nobody trusts anything that they read on the internet anymore? Nobody trusts anything that comes through to them through electronic means. What does it mean to be an institution like the Parliament in this kind of world? I personally believe that knowledge of an institution builds a degree of trust in that institution. Trust means that people are more willing to participate in the processes of that institution. And participation is what makes people value an institution like the Parliament. And so this program and this topic today, I think, is particularly relevant for where we are as a society at the moment. I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion here today. But you've heard enough from me, so I better introduce our panel members. I'll get each of them to wave at you as I go through. So Max Madison is the state political reporter with the Sydney Morning Herald. Max has given you a wave. Excellent. He's based here in the New South Wales Parliament since 2022. But before Macquarie Street, he spent, I'm sure, a much less valuable year in Canberra covering federal politics for The Australian, where he was awarded the Wallace Brown Young Journalist of the Year award. I wasn't sure in reading that whether it was the Wallace Brown Young Journalist of the Year award or whether it was the Wallace Brown Young Journalist of the Year award. Maybe you can...
It was the former.
It was the former. There you go. So he was the recipient of the Wallace Brown Young Journalist of the Year award, which makes a lot of sense. So welcome, Max. Miles Holbrook Walk is currently based in Sydney, covering national and local stories from politics, the economy and foreign affairs for the ABC. Did Miles wave at you? He did? Excellent. That's fantastic. He recently started with the audio current affairs team after a period as the Sydney correspondent for the ABC's national TV show News Breakfast. Previously, he worked covering politics and general news in the Northern Territory for the ABC. So welcome, Miles, as well. And finally, we have Denise Shrivell. Sorry, Denise, got there eventually. Someone helpfully put it phonetically for me, which is actually what tripped me up. So sorry about that. Denise has a long background in advertising, media and publishing, is a prominent advocate for democratic engagement, and built a large and active following on the hashtag Ozpol, Twitter and Blue Sky feeds, hosts the regular live podcast Spin Proof. She also curates the popular True North newsletter, which delivers daily independent news updates, and played a critical role in the creation of LENA, the Local and Independent News Association. Denise's work is dedicated to strengthening democracy and holding media and political institutions to account. I think you will agree that we have an excellent panel of people to talk to you about this topic today. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. And I'm going to turn over to Dan, who's going to take us forward from here. Dan, over to you. Excellent.
All right, thank you, Mark. It's been a busy day in relation to Parliament reporting. We've seen breakup of a long-standing federal political relationship. I'm sure that the media will be asking some questions of the executive given the current state of Sydney trains as we speak, but they're not topics we're going to address directly today. We find ourselves at a very pivotal moment in the way Australians, particularly younger Australians, access and engage with political information. The traditional media, newspapers, radio, television and public broadcasters have long played a vital role in shaping how we understand Parliament and the democratic processes that go on here. Their presence in the press gallery, their coverage of question time and their ability to hold elected officials accountable have been core to our political literacy and public discourse. But in recent years, the media landscape has rapidly shifted. Digital platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, podcasts have become key news sources for many, particularly younger Australians. According to recent reporting, over half of Gen Z now turn solely to social media for their news, often bypassing mainstream reporting altogether. This shift doesn't necessarily mean disengagement, but rather reflects a transformation of how information is packaged, consumed, and importantly, trusted. We've seen the impact of this shift play out nationally, just recently, and also here in New South Wales. In the lead up to the federal budget this year, the Albanese government invited a group of social media commentators to participate in a budget lock-up for the first time, a tradition typically reserved for accredited journalists. This move sparked debate. Was it a progressive step towards modern engagement? Is it a threat to the integrity of political reporting? Meanwhile, the AEC, the Electoral Commission, was called to review civics-focused posts by media personality Abby Chatfield about voting and enrolment. A reminder that political messaging from online creators is now being taken just as seriously as that from traditional broadcasters and newspapers. In our own state of New South Wales, we've seen increasing use of Instagram, TikTok and podcasts by MPs to try and directly connect with their constituents. Often bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of political coverage, the traditional media outlets. The convergence and sometimes collision between traditional journalism and online creators raises some significant questions. Who holds power in shaping public narratives about Parliament? How do we ensure credibility and fairness in a media environment that is decentralised and highly personalised? What does it all mean for democratic engagement and civics understanding, particularly among younger and more digitally native citizens? Today's panel, we're going to explore those questions, all of whom bring a unique perspective both generationally and professionally in the media involving their role in democracy. So whether you're here as a media personality, a student, a policymaker, or just an interested citizen, I encourage you to open your minds, reflect on what an informed, engaged public might look like in the age of scrollable news and shareable soundbites. So let's begin. Okay, so we might start just by a general question, but you can sort of introduce yourself and your experience both in the media and communications reporting about how you feel the role of media currently in reporting Parliament. How is that evolving? And what are some of the future trends that we may see further develop as we move towards the next New South Wales state election in 2027, 22 months away? Denise.
Okay, thank you everyone for having me in this absolutely beautiful room. So thank you. So as we said, my name's Denise Shrevell. I have been in the media publishing and advertising business for far too long. So I started in the mid to late 80s. It's been interesting sort of knowing that I'm speaking on this panel and reflecting on my time since those mid to late 80s. And while there's sort of some things that I can't say, and it was the mid to late 80s, so some things I actually can't remember, what I do reflect on back in those times is that back then the media had control of the media was in complete control. So they controlled the channels, and people then consumed based on the media channels that they controlled. Now that's completely flipped. The audience has control. So as people who want to reach audiences, and I would say that yes, we all want to reach audiences, I mean that's an important part of our democratic process, it's really up to us to meet audiences where they want to consume the content. So again, when I reflect back to how it was before digital sort of came along, and digital sort of first started rearing its head probably in the mid to late 90s, I was one of the first people in the country to sell a banner ad, so it's all my fault. But certainly again, we decided how people consumed our content, and that's completely flipped. And while I think that presents numerous challenges, for someone who's been involved in the media for so long, it's also what for me makes it really interesting and exciting. So what I've often seen over the years is every time a new innovation has come along, from the internet to bloggers, now of course there's a lot of talk about influencers, the legacy or traditional media has reacted in a bit of a negative way. So they've become quite defensive. So instead of perhaps, no offence, instead of perhaps embracing the new media, working out how we can include and adapt to these new environments and new landscapes, the first reaction is to be defensive. I don't think that's the way to approach it. I think the way to approach it is to really embrace new media, collaborate, work with. Again, the audience will make a decision on how they consume media, the platform, the format, the masthead, the political leaning, and so on. The audience now has complete control. That, of course, has implications for our democracy, and it's something that we need to consider very seriously. The other issues that I see, and I think that this is increasingly being raised, issues around news avoidance. That's certainly something that I'm hearing more and more about, is that people are thinking, with certainly massive global events going on, impacts of climate change, disasters happening and so on, people are, instead of consuming more news, they're completely turning away. As people who, as publishers, as campaigners, as parliamentarians, that's an issue for us. As people who are in a democracy, that's a big issue for us. Touching on this also, of course, is disinformation. So the information that they are consuming through these through these multiple platforms, and you touched on it, is there trust in it? Is it accurate information? And of course, we also need to consider that people are consuming media very differently based on their age, their ethnicity, and even their location. So we've got some big challenges. I think it's a really exciting time to be considering these issues, but these are also really important issues for our democracy. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Max?
Yeah, as previously mentioned, my name's Max. I started with the Australian newspaper, so News Corp, and then I've moved to the Sydney Morning Herald 2 years ago now. So obviously my views are going to be completely different to Nisa's in terms of the way I see the media. Look, I grew up in newspapers. I adore newspapers. I think they're such a fundamental part of the national fabric. Sorry, what was that?
I will talk to the team.
Just a bit louder.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe just move the mic closer.
Is that better?
Thank you.
Can you hear me up the back?
Could you hear me?
Okay. Look, I think obviously the media has and always will adapt to new media that emerges in any environment, right? We're, as Denise notes, generally slow to engage with it. But I think you see now the way that newspapers are on social media, you see a lot of awkward TikToks that journalists are producing at the moment. I think it's sort of a bit of a Stockholm syndrome there where they're forced to the table. But we are getting there, right? And I think it is happening with analytics. We're moving to where audiences are. But I think the important thing about new media is it is so often based on reporting that is done by traditional media. The stories that they're commenting on are initially found by journalists who are doing investigative work, who are spending weeks, if not months, digging into stories. And we saw that throughout the campaign. There was a lot of big stories about, Peter Dutton's shareholdings, for example, his property holdings, just off the top of my head. And that work can't be done without journalists doing the hard work, which I think often goes unmentioned when we're discussing new media. So yes, of course, I think there will be a place for TikToks, and you'll probably see me on there eventually. But ultimately, I think there is probably a new appreciation, or at least a growing appreciation for that work as the sort of traditional mastheads figure out their place in the world.
All right, Miles.
Brilliant. I'll just make sure I hope they can all hear me because I feel like I'm quite loud. But anyway, look, I think the better question to ask in response to this is, what does the media, whether it be new or traditional, actually see its purpose as, particularly when reporting politics? We've just come out of a federal election, and I actually reflected on my own political reporting history. My first ever story at university was covering a fight between Canterbury Council, a local soccer club, and Archery New South Wales, which it only got a distinction. I always thought it should have got an HD for uncovering one of these great council fights over real estate. But basically everywhere I've gone, whether it's in Queensland and the NT, where there's a lot more chat about crocodiles than perhaps there is in New South Wales, or even at a federal level too, there are these really common themes that play out around coverage. And I suppose for me, I think the myriad issue I really see is this question of, as the kind of real fundamental model around journalism changes, and there's a bit of an exception at the public broadcaster where we don't have to worry as much about how we're going to make this thing pay for itself, but it's really this idea of figuring out how to actually engage it with an audience, but also make sure we're really clear at what's the point of the work we're doing. And I think I just kind of wanted to share a couple of observations on that, and that is that in my own experience, political stories rich with detail can often really struggle in the initial to cut through with audiences. I think I've seen, plenty of examples just within the ABC where, a story you've worked on for some time, and, sometimes you get lucky and it goes like gold and it really gets engagement. But particularly things dense in detail that happen in buildings like the New South Wales Parliament, the NT Parliament, the Federal Parliament, that are really dense around that area, they struggle to capture the imagination. And sometimes it's because people feel like there's an absence of people in it. Sometimes I think people seeing these stories just think fundamentally that sounds really boring. But of course, we all know, because we're here tonight, just how important this stuff is. It shapes our lives in really impactful ways, some more observable than others. But that disconnect exists at the moment. And the second thing, and I think this is interesting off the back of the federal election, is that where the media's interest is and where the public's interest is can often be very disparate. And yet it still really is, in my opinion, the media that drives so much of the way our politics is communicated. And yet we can have this situation where voters feel completely like the issues that are forefront to them are just not the things that they're reading in the news, whether it be on the ABC of all places or elsewhere, particularly in traditional media. And I think that's where we've seen that really fascinating thing around particularly younger people and the way they engage in stories. And I just want to maybe do a very quick test tonight. If anyone here read the newspaper today, a physical hard copy newspaper, I love newspapers, but if you could just put your hand up if you did. So it's,
How many of it was the Sydney Morning Herald? Well done.
And then maybe just as a follow-up to that, AM radio. If you listen to an AM radio station at all today, it's a little bit more. That's kind of interesting.
Wow.
Because those two mediums in terms of physical copy newspaper and AM radio is where we're seeing really existential threats to the engagement with them. The newspapers are going a little bit better in terms of that they're able to really drive engagement online. If we look at the most engaged with news websites in Australia, they still fundamentally are legacy outlets, whether it be Nine, News Corp, ABC. They're all really still in the upper echelons. But AM radio isn't necessarily making that leap to podcasts that it might want to. And yet, I think Max can really speak to this. Politicians, particularly at a state level in Sydney, think a lot about what is on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph and 2GB radio in this city. And I think it really influences the polity that we see flow through to us. And I think the question that media has to answer is, if these are the stories that are cutting through so much, why is it the case then that we had a federal election which, by many accounts, I think it's fair to say, produced a fairly surprising result that no one in the media was really discussing in the lead up to, and certainly not in the way that we saw the Liberal Party in particular be almost entirely repudiated by the electorate. And so there were just a few observations I had.
Can I just pick up on one thing you said there? I think when you mentioned the density of reporting on Parliament and on politics, sometimes the audience doesn't necessarily engage with it in the same way that they sort of engage with a sexy crime story, for example. I mean, I think this is sort of the issue about new media, and I guess sort of media more generally, and a responsibility that we have, is that I think all media outlets are now relying on analytics, which is the number of clicks, views, subscribers that stories get. And it's these sort of important, dense stories. For example, my colleague Michael McGowan has been doing some exceptional reporting on the reforms the New South Wales government's pushing through on psychological injury. I won't sort of explain them. You can go and read them on the Sydney Morning Herald. But they're not particularly well engaged with stories, but they're so important because the people who rely on psychological injuries, workers' compensation, are some of our most vulnerable people in society. And so I think without the sort of backing of a major masthead to write these stories, I don't know where the sort of desire or engagement would be in a sort of new media space to report on that stuff. So I think we just also have to keep that in mind when we're sort of, talking about, the value of sort of TikTok influencers and the like. We just, again, I guess have to come back to the importance of these mastheads and doing this sort of really good reporting.
I think that's a really fair point, and it's certainly not a reason to not engage in those issues. I think, just speaking from my own experience in terms of the stories where they've struggled to rate at the ABC in terms of high amounts of page views or things like that, it's often about the most marginalised people in the country. I'm talking about extensive reporting in the Northern Territory on some of the poorest communities, particularly almost entirely First Nations communities in remote parts of the Northern Territory. And I think one thing I really do appreciate about legacy media is there is an engagement with boots on the ground reporting, that, and I think is the real limitation of new media. But at the same time, to Denise's point about the two can't really be considered as enemies here, and I think rather there's almost a symbiotic relationship in some ways. What the challenge of the symbiotic relationship, particularly for commercial media, I think, is if you've put all the resources into creating this reporting and then seemingly it is repurposed and repackaged with a bit of commentary and analysis, what that does to your own model of journalism, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've probably stolen a bit of my thunder, both Max and Miles, but
Sorry.
No, that's okay, because it's right on point. And then I said to you I would cite your article from the Herald today. It was certainly the personal injury is an ongoing series of importance. Max's article today, reporting on the troubled M6 motorway in southern Sydney, raises some really significant questions about cost and engineering that are questions of the executive and the public sector. a great article, but it doesn't translate well to a 30-second TikTok so well, engineering failures in southern Sydney. So I'm interested, because of what you've just touched on, so what are the models in the media that maybe are emerging to try and support that essential work? So some of the best journalism revolving around parliaments involves that time and investigation and building a case, building sources, freedom of information requests, and that requires resources. So are there models you're seeing perhaps in the traditional media that are supporting some of that in-depth journalism?
Yeah, I think they are. I think you're starting to see in most mastheads, there's probably more of a split happening where there's more investment being made in those sort of longer term, deep dive stories, which we're allowed to invest in weeks of our time to go and look at stories like the M6. That was a colleague and I started looking into that, I think, 4 months ago, and today it was published in the masthead, and it was followed up by the fact that CPB decided to walk away from the M6, which is a fairly big deal. Look, I think, yeah, mastheads are backing that sort of reporting, but I think in terms of new technological developments, AI will play a role. I rely on AI for some aspects of my reporting in terms of research, not the writing, obviously, but it helps you cut corners if you're sort of doing data inputs, if you're sort of looking to summarize a sort of issue of a day, if you're trying to collate a lot of things. I find ChatGPT can be really helpful with that. But ultimately, the best reporters, whether it's Nick McKenzie, whether it's Kate McClymont, what you take from them is the exceptional amount of dedication and graft that they put in every single day. There's nothing that can substitute for their work ethic, and I think ultimately that's why journalism will always have a place in society, even if it looks a little bit different, because of the reliance on just those fundamental human characteristics.
Well, just as an addendum to that, and I think Kate McClymont and Nick McKenzie, you'd be hard-pressed to find better journalists in this country, so this is by no means a kind of a knock on them. But I don't think, and this applies to ABC too, that traditional media has a patent and a mortgage on that work ethic and that exceptional journalistic ability. And I think we actually see some pretty impressive independent examples in Australia already. I think Michael West is a fantastic example. Anthony Claxon is another one who I think both of these people have, traditional journalism backgrounds too, I should note as well, but also have been able to carve out an incredible kind of independent approach to it. And it is different, I think, to what we think of in new media, which is, I think, people doing TikToks or, perhaps what more people engage on here, Instagram in particular, and having a presence there. But that, it's that mentality, isn't it, really, that the great qualities that they have, which you spoke about as work ethic and graft, those things don't necessarily have to only exist in traditional or legacy media.
And it's interesting to reflect too. I mean, there's a difference between reporting, which is sort of what Max is maybe pointing to, and then opinion. And of course, quite often we see the clickbait, because the revenue model is now based on how many people are viewing, is based on sometimes quite inflamed opinion, where you're quite right. The very good reporting that is still done by a lot of legacy media perhaps doesn't get the attention that it should be getting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of critical to draw a couple of distinctions here. I think, as Denise pointed out, there's reporting and there's commentary, and within reporting, there's sort of investigative or sort of boots on the ground reporting, and then there's reporting on news of the day, right, which is equal as important, right? We've got a team out there sort of doing live commentary on what's happening with this trains crisis, and I think that's really important for everyday commuters. But I think ultimately the stories that make a massive difference are the ones that take, months or even years to report on.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm going to sort of get back to what I did mention in my early comments, and we've seen at the federal election that growth with news limited reporting, Gen Z and millennials now making up 47% of the electorates they were reporting, in comparison to boomers at 33%. I do note that, again, Gen X is missing. Denise, I feel your pain. But we combine that with the knowledge, and certainly the education and engagement team here at Parliament is acutely aware that the National Australian Assessment Program on Civics and Citizenship from 2023 says only 38% of Year 10 students meet a proficient standard in understanding Australia's democratic processes. So I guess the question, and I'm interested to find out, is what role do you think media, both traditional and new, has in producing just that civics knowledge and understanding of the process. Certainly in the lead up to the federal election, we saw some traditional media outlets, ABC, Guardian, SMH, really, along with some of the new content producers, producing some just very civics-focused content, like how does preferential voting work? So is there a role for media to do that, or is that a space where they can work alongside those new media influencers or content creators, or as Hannah Ferguson would prefer, commentators?
I mean, I think there's been some exceptional reporting on this, and I think media obviously has a really important role to play in that respect because of the way that it makes it digestible and easily to consume for readers or for students, right? I think, having obviously done high school myself, I found the problem with civics was it could come across as quite dry, whereas I think media and the teams there at the moment, whether it's Hannah Ferguson or whether it's the Sydney Morning Herald or ABC, they're doing an incredible job of using videos, using graphics, using explainers in sort of very punchy ways to engage audiences, right? And I think some of those explainers, well, I can only speak from our experience, do incredibly well because you see people out, they want to know this stuff, right? And they don't have that sort of understanding, probably because they weren't paying enough attention in high school, but there is such a demand for it. So I think, the media has a really important role to play in that respect.
I completely agree. I'd say there's kind of two elements to that. One is about, particularly if it's for young people, not making the mistake of talking down to the audience, being cringe, or just this really hand-fisted way of talking to people as though, and I remember it distinctly during the Australian marriage equality postal survey, where it was a joke made by, it was a joke admittedly, so maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, about, young people might have to learn what a post box is. And it's the kind of thing that would just make someone scrunch up their face and think, I don't want to engage with that anymore. And I think, it's I suppose incumbent on media when they do this kind of journalism is to really just play it absolutely straight with the explainers. And I think one thing to media's credit around that is we have a whole new category of awards in certain, I think it's the Walkleys, it might be the Kennedys, but either way, there are awards for explanatory journalism because the necessity of it and the place it holds within Australian media, and I think even more so, I see this particularly in the US and British media as well, it obviously has a very clear role. And interestingly too, I think allows people to enter in whether they've kind of had very low interest in a particular issue or even more broadly the whole political process at a pretty easy point. And the benefit of the internet, right, is we have a myriad of links where bang, 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 you can be explained, you want to read a bit more here, you can go there, want to read a bit more here, you can go there. And that, I think, has been a good confluence and perhaps one of the kind of the good things the media has a story to tell of in the last decade.
I think it's great that at last we're talking about media and voter literacy. I think both are greatly needed. As someone who has done how to votes and participated and so on, seeing people not making up their mind about who they're voting for until they're in that line about to vote is frankly a bit horrifying. We need to, and particularly we're compulsory voters, we're compulsory turner-uppers. We don't have to vote when we get into that box, so I encourage everyone to do that, of course. We're not really taught how to vote. I don't think many people know how parliaments work, whether that be state, territory or federal. I think there's a great need for better voter literacy, media literacy, certainly at school level, as people are navigating social media and all the different platforms that are now available. But I also think that that's greatly needed for older people too, who are increasingly, of course, consuming legacy or traditional media, but also getting their news and their content from more digital-based services. Particularly with the disinformation on top of everything, it is really difficult. I mean, I'm very into politics. I follow it very closely every day, and sometimes I get stumped. But, you learn who to trust, you learn to look for sources, you learn what sounds right and so on, particularly with AI coming in. And I do think that will be an increasingly large issue for the 2027 New South Wales election. We saw it emerging a little bit in the federal election. I think voter and media literacy for everyone, not just for young people, but for old people, is really important. I don't know if the government is going to do it. Sometimes I feel like they don't want us to know how to vote and they don't want us to know how to consume media. That might be a little bit unfair. I can see some people nodding though. But yes, I'm absolutely all for that. I don't agree with the social media bans. I think much better would be media literacy from school age and beyond than banning. Bans never work. We all know that. Education works.
That is true. Now, Miles, you've got some experience teaching, reporting in the
Miles.
Northern Territory, also teaching as
I've
well.
never been a teacher in my
apparently.
life. You got the wrong Miles.
And in far north Queensland. And I know, Denise, you've got some opinions in regards to access. So the question is, the changing media landscapes also had a very profound impact on rural and regional communities. We've seen the demise of a lot of regional newspapers, etc. So how can we ensure that those minority and regional voices continue to be heard, and also from the other way that those issues that impact them that originate from Parliament are communicated to those communities effectively?
Do you want to kick off, Denise, or do you want?
Sure.
Sure.
In regard, and you're quite right. I mean, gosh, we've seen what's happened today with the Nat-Lib split as well. To just get into our minds, perhaps an increasing split between regional, rural, and then urban city people and voters. The one point I also always like to make with this is that our internet connectivity is really bad. I'm sure there's people, again, sitting in this room that struggle with mobile connectivity and perhaps even internet connectivity. It's really important that, particularly that we're relying increasingly on digital channels, that Australians can access the information that we're creating. I just hosted 12, people will know if they know me, I'm very involved with the community independence movement. I just hosted 12 podcasts with candidates throughout the country. And oh my goodness, it is so noticeable, the bad internet connectivity throughout the country. And I really think that we need to be focusing on that, on those foundations, because then we can have a better conversation about the content that people are accessing in these regional and rural areas. And again, this is an important issue for our democracy.
Two things I want to add on that as well. I think if we look at local media, the really sad thing, as you point out, is the retraction of many great mastheads. In Mackay, we lost the Daily Mercury's print edition. Now it's kind of relegated to a tab on the Courier Mail's homepage. This is a Queensland outlet, and Mackay Courier Mail's a larger News Corp-owned masthead. Both are part of the same organisation and structure. And another where we've seen a recession was Channel 9's decision to cut their 9 Darwin bulletin, seemingly at incredibly short notice to the staff who even worked there. And I think that is a really sad thing that, yes, obviously commercial media is engaging with this big question around making it work. I think in particularly with the Darwin instance, the recession of 9 from there was something that was really quite tragic, and I think was part of that organisation's social licence to do much of the great reporting it had done from the Northern Territory, and to turn that away was a decision. Now, there are questions around should government, try to work to guarantee the presence of certain media, whether it be through community broadcasting, which we know that's something that's fought over a lot and, gets a carving out in the federal budget, but really in the grand scheme of things is quite negligible. But I think that other element you talk about in terms of participation in the actual political process, really, there is only so much media you can do there. I think that ultimately becomes a job for electoral commissions. I don't think it's necessarily the case that more or less media coverage in regional and rural Australia has contributed to voter turnout in Lingiari, which is the large electorate that covers most of the Northern Territory outside of Darwin, pretty much the entire landmass elsewhere. I don't think that's because of the presence of media there. It's really about the nature of the geography there and the sheer cost and the tyranny of distance that is dealt with by those bigger parts of Australia. I think it's a reasonable question to ask around how much government should be involved in that, because I think there always becomes that uncomfortable question of ensuring people who are going to vote are doing so of their own volition and not kind of being coerced into voting for any political party in particular.
Can I just add to finish my answer? We are seeing a lot of news deserts around the country where there is no local news. I think one of the green shoots that we're seeing in the media and news landscape is communities taking these issues into their own hands and literally launching their own hyper-local media outlet. In my area, we have In the Cove, in the Cove attends every single council meeting. Now, in the days, the Manly Daily or the North Shore Times would fulfil that role. They're no longer fulfilling that role. So we're seeing great engaged citizens stepping up and filling that gap to launch their own hyperlocals. And indeed, that's what LINA, so the Local Independent News Association, oversees throughout the country. And again, a green shoot where we're seeing these community-owned, community-controlled publications popping up around the country. And I think that's a really exciting development.
All right, this one, there's a follow-up perhaps
Sorry,
to what you said, Miles, in terms of there's only so much media can do in terms of that civics engagement, and it should fall to something like an electoral commission, noting that electoral commission in New South Wales is cyclical and linked to the parliamentary cycle. So again, it might get me in trouble with my boss, but is there a role for parliaments themselves in promoting an understanding of the systems that effectively govern those that represent the community at these places?
Sure, and they already do this to a degree. I mean, many people might remember their own school tours of New South Wales Parliament or other parliaments in their lifetime. That does occur to a degree. I guess the question is, and I note that the Governor-General, I think it's just this week, has launched a new program around encouraging better civics knowledge after they found the worst results on record since 2004 when they started examining this. But that there are projects and things at work. I think what's interesting is you have to contend with how the world changes, how people change, and how the way we consume things change. I mean, no one had a smartphone in a classroom in 2004. Admittedly, there are several social media bans, and indeed many schools have phone bans in place, but you do have to think about, are there other ways around doing that? And I think that's perhaps one element of it. I think, though, I will say in defence of parliaments and politics and civics broadly, is there is a challenge about trying to make it interesting, and that has existed since, I dare say, federation in this country for children.
Yeah, look, very true.
I'd actually argue there's probably a greater role. I think the Australian Electoral Commission does an exceptional job in countering misinformation online. Like, you only have to see how responsive they are during election campaigns, and they probably could do more throughout the cycle if their funding was boosted. And, I think maybe New South Wales Parliament, Dan, maybe a role for you moving forward.
Thanks, Max. The check's in the mail. Okay, so we've got some agreement that we're seeing. There's moving forward, that there's going to be a relationship between traditional media and new media, and we're going to find a way that they can continue to work together. So what ethical responsibilities then should apply across both fields? Like, professional journalists are held to an account both by their employer and codes of conduct. So how should social media commentators, or should they be held to the same account? And how can we effectively control that in the misinformation sort of era?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Look, I think, as you pointed out, journalists have to abide by a code of ethics. We have an ethical compass as well, which we generally try to ascribe by. I think the thing that I've noted about social media influencers and commentators is there seems to be a sense amongst the public is what they're saying is sort of God's given truth. And a lot of them, and I think they have, like Hannah Ferguson in particular, is incredibly articulate. She's got a very great understanding of how the Australian political system works, but she obviously has a political bias inherent in her views. And that's not to say you can't have a bias. I mean, we are all biased in our own ways, but I think that needs to be sort of laid on the table a little bit more than it is. I think as journalists try as hard as we can, well, most of us do, to be as impartial as possible. We try to check our facts, we try to corroborate things, and I think we try and get both sides of the story. And I don't necessarily think that happens in the sort of new media domain as much. And, I'm happy to be sort of argued with on that point. But, I think that's sort of where I see the issues.
So there's probably two things. One was we do have ACMA who regulate Australian media to some degree. There is a lot of critique around the ability of them to actually effectively do that. And that pops up very much in traditional media and not even necessarily the kind of traditional media we might think of in terms of, doing hard-hitting news and current affairs, just in general kind of the stuff that's broadcast. I think with the transparency thing, I agree. But I think that the transparency thing, and I dare say there's some people in this room who feel like there is legacy media that is completely non-transparent about its very obvious biases in a way it picks up certain particular issues and the like. And so the things around transparency, I agree, need to be declared and should be more public. One thing I think traditional media perhaps has a little bit more of an advantage is you generally have a larger editorial group, focus, etc. So there are checks and balances on people that are beyond just their own, and they are very flawed. But I think generally on most news coverage work reasonably well. But the real frustration I often hear from audience feedback is just that there is a view that people have, and people have come to me and said, you're this or that, and you have these views, and yada yada, and yet you never come clean about them with the audience. And I think that's, and sometimes those views are misguided, but sometimes I think that critique is a reasonable one, and that idea of kind of declared transparency, is a really interesting thing. I actually think that, to the Sydney Morning Herald's credit, one piece of coverage I really want to point out that I think they did this very well was their Las Vegas trip to the US. The NRL was launching its season there, and regularly it was declared that in part some of that travel for some of its staff was paid for by the NRL. And I think that at the very least is a good declaration. There are some obligations around sponsored content for people who are producing stuff online, but that could definitely be tightened up a lot more.
Yep.
When I started selling ads a long time ago, we had advertorials. I don't know if anyone remembers those. It used to be the advertorial would be up the top. So if money changes hands, it needs to be declared. It's as simple as that. So I really believe in that. Yes, you're quite right, Miles, in pointing out that, I think that transparency needs to be across the board. Political biases, hard when you've got a News Corp in your market, not to be pointing to News Corp knowing full well what their intent is. So it feels like to me sometimes rules are being put, or we're putting requirements on a group of people, but we're not applying those requirements to everyone in the news producing landscape. I would like to see those requirements put across everyone. If you've got quite often we see PR-driven content, that should be declared. If money's changed hands, that should be declared. Any influence needs to be declared. And again, part of that to me also comes back to what I mentioned before is media literacy. Educate your audience for the content that they're creating. And I think a lot of these issues that we're discussing, and these issues are going to change and evolve. We're talking influencers at the moment. There will be something else that we're talking about in the next 3 to 5 years that we're also concerned about. That's the beauty of the media, and what makes it, again, interesting for me. It's changing and evolving all the time. There's something that we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years that we're not thinking of now, that still will require, that will still play a role in our democracy, and will still require transparency about the intent behind its creation. And as a consumer of media, I would like to know that.
Thank you very much. Changing tack a little bit, although Miles's vox pop around the number of AM radio listeners was also very pleasing to see. Perhaps a question first to Denise. So it's been reported that podcast audiences in Australia have grown by over 30% in the last 2 years. With political podcasts becoming a key source of parliamentary reporting for many people out in the community, especially younger listeners, your Spin-Proof podcast being one of them that you previously produced. So how is this surge in political podcasts reshaping the way Parliament is reported, and what challenges and opportunities does it present in maintaining journalistic standards? Noting as well, we're also seeing members attempting to use that format to directly connect with their constituents, bypassing traditional media outlets.
And I suppose my comment to parliamentarians using podcast, really that's owned media. So you own the channel that you're producing the content through. I suppose my comment to that is what took so long. Like, it's a channel that's been there for some time. Any way that you can connect with your constituents, your consumers, whatever, you should be doing now. Again, we're meeting the audiences based on their needs. I'm excited by the podcasters that we're seeing pop up. Again, there will be something else that comes up in the next 5 to 10 years. I think everything has a role now. People, again, consume their content in so many different ways. We don't have to exclude one because something new's come along. Everything will have its role. podcasting, I think, is really exciting.
Yeah, I think particularly for political journalism, I love the detail and depth that you can get into, kind of what Miles was talking about before. Like, going back to the analytics of our story, I mean, shamefully, the number of people who get to the very end is sometimes in the teens. So, but your ability to sit and listen to a podcast for half an hour while you're cooking dinner or cleaning the house gives you a way to access news, which I don't think people did otherwise. Like, it does take a bit of time to sit through and consume a 1,000 or 2,000 word story, but if you can listen to it, it's so much better. And so I think the media entrepreneurs who can access that, and I think America obviously has some exceptional people in this space. Like, I think Ezra Klein does an incredibly good job of digesting and articulating sort of very complex sort of political policies and movements over there. And I think we're starting to see a bit more in Australia now, where people are doing a really good job of just giving a reader a broader understanding of the story of the day as opposed to just the headline. And I think that can only be good for sort of political and media literacy.
I completely agree. I've got to say, I think it's been a real democratisation, and generally, and this is perhaps a matter of somewhat of an opinion here, but that we've seen well-produced, well-informed, well-researched podcasts. I think if you look at the Triton ranker, with most of the news podcasts that are at the top are coming from places that do dedicate resources to their work. Some of them are legacy, many of them indeed are legacy, in fact. But even newer podcasts that are perhaps done by kind of journalists who don't work in large newsrooms, it's the ones that are well made and often well thought out and dense in their content.
Well, even just some of the just hour-long chats that we had with politicians over. I mean, they were really engaging. You got to know someone you might have been considering voting on a very different level. Again, shouldn't be everything that you base your decision on, but it certainly can help you make your decision. It's a different way to getting it all has a role.
Yeah, I mean, I just think Fran Kelly's sort of podcast hour that she does is really interesting, because having listened to her on RN, there was always quite a combative, I guess, environment when someone would come onto that program to be interviewed. But when they go onto a program, onto a podcast, there seems to be more relaxed, and they're more willing to sort of just speak off the cuff. And I think it creates, for me anyway, you get these incredibly rich little details in sort of people's stories. She did one a couple of weeks ago of David Chandler, the former building commissioner, and they just really laid bare the sort of state of the building industry in New South Wales. And I just wouldn't have thought you would be able to get that sort of level of detail on just a regular interview. And I think that's a really important part of it as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Max, you touched on your use of, say, ChatGPT. So exploring AI a little bit, perhaps, Max and Moz, are you seeing AI become more integrated in a more traditional newsroom? And what are some of the guidelines that perhaps your organisations put around the use of those? And I guess as a general question, do we see that AI will improve that accessibility and content, or is there a risk that it oversimplifies or in fact reinforces some of the misinformation that we might see elsewhere on the internet?
So, with the ABC, and I speak for myself here, the ABC itself has a whole bunch of editorial policies around many parts of our coverage. AI is a newer one. There are things that we're approved to use. There are things that we're instructed not to use. It's kind of fascinating, because we think AI, we think ChatGPT and the like, but things like transcription through Microsoft is a program that we've decided, that's something it's trustworthy and it's reliable in the way it can be used, and it's secure in terms of if that information was stored somewhere on a device and was what threats would there be to its security and stuff like that. I think the benefits of it are very obvious, and outsourcing work that otherwise is actually often just menial rather than deeply essential to. I think if you're asking AI, for example, to what are the questions I should ask so-and-so today, I think that is a worry, because you're outsourcing a really critical part of the journalism, which is thinking about what matters to people, what are the things that I'm curious about myself. And if you lower those skills, I think they're a bit more like a muscle, that the less you use them, that can be a problem. But I think in terms of, there are parts of the journalism which it's very happy that we're no longer doing that. I think, even other technological revolutions, around, switching from camera tapes we used to film in through, literally using film versus digital transmission back to an office and a newsroom. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, look, I think Capital Brief reported today that News Corp's going to force all their journalists to undertake AI training. So if anyone was under any illusions that AI wasn't going to affect journalism, I think we have it there today. I mean, I think journalism has, as I discussed before, some innate sort of characteristics about it, which mean that it will be a little bit immune to AI. But I mean, ultimately, right, this is an incredibly fast learning and technologically advanced force, which I don't think any of us have really properly wrapped our head around. And so I think in the way that it engaged in my reporting, and as Miles discussed, it's about cutting corners at the moment, doing the menial work that otherwise would have taken you an hour to add data into a spreadsheet or to sort of summarize a document. But even within that, I mean, I think summarizing documents, you often miss a sort of key little detail in there which could end up making an incredible story. So, but I don't know what it will look like in 10 years, say, you know, how much it will potentially grow and change in that time. It's, beyond me.
Just one addendum onto that, which is the importance of having teams within traditional news media. And this is a big strength of news media that I think it does this better than new media can, which is fact-checking and verifying information. Particularly, I mean, we have a big team dedicated now at the ABC called Verify that works with dealing with information, particularly studying, or rather covering, I should say, overseas conflict, where material you have to really be discerning, but it is very hard when you may not have a reporter in that part of the world. And so those things are really interesting. And I think the BBC's also been a bit of a world leader on that one too, to be fair to them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So we've reached the point in the evening where we have an opportunity for members of the audience, both with us here today and also online. So for those of us who are watching online, you should have also received a link to our Slido application. I know there were some questions submitted there, but if I could turn over to my lovely colleagues from Education Engagement who will be wandering the room with a microphone. Are there any questions from the audience for the panel?
Why, where to go first? Might go up the frontier first. And then we'll have one from Slido. So everyone else can start thinking.
Hi there, my name is Sandy Killick from Democracy Matters, and thank you for this great conversation. A comment about the civics and citizenship test results. It came off the back of COVID and also came off the back of public school teachers being put off talking about political issues like the referendum because the Department of Education circulates a controversial issues memo to schools, which makes the teachers wary about doing something that's considered controversial. I don't think discussions about democracy are controversial, and we should be encouraging people to learn how to listen to different opinions. And my work is non-partisan, and I think that's one of the things that papers can offer. The question that I've got for you is, how can we move away from old language like hung parliament, which I don't think really reflects the benefits of minority government in improving our decision making? And I think hung parliaments does impact upon voters' decisions about whether to, how they'll use their vote. So it'd be good to hear your comments about moving away from that language that I think is biased.
Anyone like to field that one?
I don't think we'll be talking hung parliament for a while in the federal parliament, would be my first comment. 93 supermajority. My goodness, who saw that coming? Sandy, thank you for that question. I have seen you before at an event, and well done on your work. I mean, it's such an important topic that you advocate for, so thank you. Balanced parliament, I think, is a better term, to be honest. And I think Karen Phelps was the one that actually came up with that first, so I will give her credit for that. Look, I think there's a lot of... It's almost like we've got all of these new channels, we've got this new parliament that's emerging and so on. We do need new language. Language is important, words are important. We need new language to be describing this. We get influences, new media, opinion versus reporting. We do need better definitions around the new landscape that we're operating in. That's for sure.
Yeah, look, I think probably as you'd expect, I mean, coming from a two-party majority system, I just don't think anyone has really had time to think about moving forward. I think with the way that primary votes are heading, I think inevitably we're going to have to start but sort of looking at the fact that Australia is going to have a multi-party coalition system of government moving forward. And I think those sort of conversations around language will inevitably come out of it. As Denise noted, it's probably a couple of election cycles away now. But yeah, I think, New South Wales will obviously have a balance of power. We held with a couple of my independents here in the lower house. And I think it is generally a fairly harmonious and good operating system that they've got here. So look, I think, yeah, absolutely. I've never really bought into the sort of the doom that comes from independents and minor parties being elected. But I think, as that becomes more normalised, I think those conversations will happen naturally.
Yeah, whether the term hung parliament influences votes, I appreciate you may have heard an anecdote about it. I honestly don't think that's necessarily, if we look at even in seats where we had a strong independent campaign running against an incumbent MP, either in the opposition or now the newly elected government, whether or not that was a decisive factor. It does worth, when we think about all sorts of language that we use, examining that stuff. And I think Max is right, and that it will evolve over time, because minority governments, parliaments where there's no one party with a majority in a very distinct possibility in the future. But at the same time, do I think the term hung parliament is particularly insidious one? Not necessarily, but I think it is worth examining all of those things. And I think sometimes that's where you'll probably see politicians pushing that back a bit more through channels in media where they talk about that. And I think a classic example of language is just with the independents who are community-backed, who really push back against being called a teal. They take umbrage with it, and they say, there's no such thing as a teal, etc. And they have a space to at least prosecute that argument. And I think where people can hear that, and I think particularly when you get at forums where you get longer running interviews, like what Denise does as well in particular, there is the chance for people to answer that question and to articulate that as well. As for whether or not that kind of cuts through in an accessibility type, I think that's a tricky question to answer.
Okay, now, did we decide we were going to go to a question from the...
Yeah, but I'm right here, so...
Okay, all right. So let's one more question from the floor.
Just here. Yes?
Hi, I'm just general public, so...
General public.
It's not, I know. Go after that, sorry.
First name general.
Ursula, Look, I just wanted to ask, I guess, about, you were talking about education before and the role of, I guess, the Electoral Commission, etc. And my thought really goes to critical thinking and, I guess, the role of sort of educating the public on critical thinking, particularly with, and I don't think the word algorithm came up in your discussion. I don't know if that's on purpose, but I get worried about the algorithms and the direction that they take, people in, and then how, do we cut through that to ensure, there's some sense of critical thinking, particularly for our younger audience.
Obviously critical thinking is a skill that we learn in high school and in university, but it's also a muscle, right? Like we have to seek out thoughts that are critical to our own. I think it's very easy in today's society to just find comfort in a view or a worldview that sort of sits in kind of line with your own. And I think that's kind of, I see my friends do that a little bit. They sort of only seek news from one source or from one influencer. And I often challenge them to look more broadly and try and, challenge their own views. So I think, critical thinking is such an important aspect, right? And I think it's about trying to get people outside of their comfort zone, and whether that's sort of, I think the media tries to do that in something, and I think, the opinion pages of media outlets now are doing a better job at sort of getting a variety of views which sort of provide contradictory opinions. But I guess people have to come to that of their own accord. You can't ram it down their throat.
I think it's a really fair point about that, about saying, what can any Australian media outlet do to push back on Meta's algorithms and the way, you speak about young people. For me, I think there are a lot of older Australians who get radicalised online very quickly. And I think COVID, we saw that happen as a phenomenon, and a well-researched phenomenon now in academia too. There is, I think, a limitation to what the Australian media has to try to dismantle forces that are clearly, I think, larger than its own by orders of magnitude, other than to put that work out there. What always strikes me, and I'd be surprised if it was different for the others, is that the ABC covers a lot of stories every day, and some people just don't see them at all. And they'll do sometimes, and it's not even necessarily that it was too hyper-local an issue or it didn't get enough page views. It might have done really well online, but that just, it's a critique that someone says, why don't you cover this? And I'll be like, Russ, right here, we covered it there. Or we did it here a week before too as well. So it is a tricky one on that, and I'm not sure that Australian media can do a whole lot with those, large companies right now, other than to, try to make its work accessible as possible, steer people back to its own platforms as well, where that is perhaps a little bit easier to navigate, and that engagement is not necessarily encouraged purely on commenting. Most news media outlets, the comments aren't necessarily immediately available on their own site. You certainly can't comment as quickly as you can do on social media sites where these are repurposed.
I do wonder how the ABC, once the Gen X and Boomers go, how they're going to remain relevant to such a dispersed media environment, and where the algorithms will only get stronger, I suppose.
It's a great question. I'm certainly not authorised by ABC management in terms of saying what are the kind of existential answers to that question from an organisation role. Just my personal opinion, it's a big challenge, and all media has to think about it a lot. I am reassured somewhat that in terms of news websites in Australia, I believe the ABC is the second most read after news.com, but most legacy media does have a place among the most visited websites that say and package themselves as news media. Similarly with podcasts, I think among as I say, I don't want to bore you with kind of silly statistics what they might feel like, but the ABC's products are among the most listened to on there. And I think that is reassuring to a degree. We're also very lucky that we're publicly funded. So the commercial challenges that is really, I think, caused a lot of disruption in media in the last decade or so, that perhaps has not stung the ABC in as clearly an observable way. There are obviously other challenges, though, when you have fewer media outlets across the board, which I think is always a regrettable thing.
There are many aspects of the news media or the information ecosystem that I'm very concerned about. I'm as concerned about the algorithm on social media as I am about the overt bias that I see through various traditional media outlets. So the content some of the content I'm concerned about, but then the algorithm that's then used to push that content I'm concerned about. It requires regulation, I think, but of course we find ourselves in a situation where some governments are reluctant to regulate, and we also find ourselves in a landscape where, again, these innovations and technology evolve so quickly that regulation can't keep up. So it's no doubt a really important issue, and I think it's great to raise it. Again, part of this comes back to media literacy. If your media consuming public understands the issues that are being faced in the information ecosystem, then surely that will also alleviate some of the concerns with it.
All right. If we go to one question from Slido and then perhaps one more from our audience here.
How do you ensure balanced reporting when covering political debates or parliamentary question time, considering their general theatricality, your own deadlines and multiple press releases coming your way?
It's a very good question, and one I still have not mastered. Look, I think in an age of 24/7 media where things are changing constantly, I think it's a really hard balance to get right, because inevitably the most inflammatory comment is going to get to the top of the story, right? And some politicians have become masterminds of doing that. I think John Barilaro, the former deputy premier of his place, was very good at sort of weaponizing that for his own devices. I think as journalists we have to sort of take a breath, and I think we have to consider what's in the best interest of our audience. And I think sometimes that means sort of maybe cutting down on the sort of more inflammatory comments and sort of including, I guess, more context to ensure that we get a broader understanding of the conversation at hand. I actually think sort of the Guardian and the Sydney Morning Herald's blog, and I think the ABC actually as well, to do a really good job of kind of capturing those things now. I think they've gone away and just and providing a little bit more context, like I said before.
Yeah, and it's tricky, you're right, because you don't want to be seen to be ignoring a story either when something extraordinary happens, particularly in Parliament, but also at that same time really balancing it against, I think, also being able to try to look beyond what is happening inside these walls and actually try to do one of two things that are really tricky. The first one is really getting to the heart of the detail of something, because that takes time, and it's much easier to turn around something quickly from a live feed from Parliament or a quick radio interview that's been done, whereas that might require you to do some considered research, talk to multiple experts with differing opinions and different interests of their own. But the other thing is actually going out and speaking to voters, which you have to always be careful for, because you can't speak to a truly representative number of people at once. But it's, I guess, about trying to use your judgment to find out who are the people most impacted by these stories. Are their voices being captured in the coverage? And if not, how can we do that in a certain way? Now, that's not necessarily easy to do for breaking news, but certainly that longer form work has to really engage with that as well.
And I'm perhaps a bit more of a truthful, not neutral person, so I follow the Christina Amanpour saying there. I'll again dedicate that to her. Balance, or is nuance, perspective and context more important, I wonder? So I think about an issue such as climate change. There's no balance on climate change. I'm sorry, but there isn't. There might be balance on the way that we solve issues around climate change. But if we're talking about balance on an issue of climate change, then does that straight away mean that you get a denier and then an agreeer? There's some issues that are fact-based issues and to me don't require balance. Perhaps the solutions require balance. But I do see some media outlets also giving credit to fact-based issues that really should not be given credit to. So the nuclear debate that we've just recently seen, there was no credible economist or scientist or climate expert in the country that was saying that nuclear was a good idea for us. But it was given a lot of credit by the media, and I thought that was a mistake. So when we're talking about balance, I'll come back to truthful, not neutral, and perhaps using words like perspective and context for some issues. Social issues, certainly, balance. There are a variety of different views out there on social issues, but not on fact-based issues, surely.
If I could just push back on the nuclear thing, I think if you have the coalition as the main opposition party putting up their main energy policy as nuclear, right, which the estimates were between $330 and $660 billion. I mean, I think you have to take that at face value, right? I don't think as a media we can ignore or sort of turn to one side. I mean, the coalition ultimately ended up doing that of their own accord, but I think we have to take everything on face value, and I think it's really important to actually drill into these issues. And the reason why we know that there's no economists or who back in nuclear energy is because the media went out and interviewed them. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to get those voices out there. So look, I think there is a fine balance between sort of taking sort of seemingly ridiculous notions, but also sort of assessing them for their merit.
All right, I think we've got one
We have.
more time for one
Last
more
one in the
question.
room, but not the end of the discussion.
Hi, I'm Victor. I'm an editor for the student newspaper On Histoire. My question is, you talked quite early on about engagement rates with dry and dense topics being much lower. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the changes to workers' compensation, because I've been following that quite closely. It was almost a month ago when the union sounded the alarm bell. In topics like these that might get slightly lower traction, things like industrial relations, especially higher legislation, inquiries, hearings. I know not everyone reads the Hansard for fun like I do, and you did mention earlier that it does stem from a general civics education and a general interest in all this. But from the press side, what can we do to make it more interesting for the audience?
First of all, I'm happy that someone also reads Hansard for fun like I do.
Yeah, look, it's a tough one, right? I mean, I think, as I said before, psychologically humans are more inclined to seek out negative or sort of news like crime, which is packed full of excitement. But I think as journalists, we have to be able to capture the voices. I think Miles was discussing this quite well before about capturing the voices in these stories, which make them sort of understandable and digestible for the general public, right? I think the thing about this psychological injury compensation, as you know, is that it's obviously going to affect these incredibly vulnerable people. So getting their voices out there to understand what the impact of pushing this through and increasing the thresholds for claiming these lump sum payments will be. I think, are they ever going to be the most read stories on the site? No, but I think as long as we can convey the importance of them, editors will probably give them their backing, and they'll at least get some sort of engagement and interest, which will then force debate in the broader public sort of town square.
I think fundamentally it just goes back to who is this affecting and why, and really getting deep into that issue. Sometimes the political issues that get the most traction in media are often really divorced from that anyway, but there's just a fascination about it. Or, and I think an example of this is cabinet postings among the Labor Party. I actually don't know how much interest there is in that among the public. There is some, for sure, and it is important to a degree. But at the same time, I think if we really look at the issue at hand and, just trying to temper the politics of the day, which is played out in a very different way, and in many ways it's driven by the people who are kind of driving the news agenda, and by that I mean politicians. They're much more willing to sometimes talk about these personal beefs than they are necessarily about a dense issue where they're trying to shift change on, because perhaps there is a quicker payoff for them for the former, not the latter. And so I think that's one of the things just to note with that as well, is that if you can go back to source material, but then just really bringing it into who are these stories affecting, and I guess that thing of the media understanding its own purpose of why are we telling the stories we're telling, particularly in politics, and what's the real deeper question we're asking our audience to consider.
And perhaps that this is why we're seeing some of these new commentators or online influencers, or whatever we like to call them. I know they are putting a lot of effort into getting complex issues, and then how do we explain this to audiences in a more simple way. So Punter's Politics is the one that comes to my mind. He's an economics teacher, I think, and he puts a lot of effort into communicating quite complex issues in really easy to digest ways. And I actually think that's really such a challenging thing to do, because as Max says, these are really important stories that impact often the most vulnerable people in our community, and they're really important stories to be told. But people are now not consuming media, of course, in the way that they used to, and that time economy that we're in, where people are scrolling, they're reading headlines, they're not deep diving into stories. It's a big problem for our democracy. So again, how do we give journalists, other communicators, other content creators, how can we encourage them to be getting these really complex issues and explaining them to audiences in the way that audiences want to consume them? And again, this comes back to my original point. News consumers and audiences are now in control. We need to be meeting their needs.
All right. I'm afraid that's all the time we do have for questions this evening. I do sense there's probably more questions in the audience, so I do apologise for that. But would everybody please join me in showing our appreciation for the panel this evening? I'd also like to thank Mark for opening proceedings, and I know it is a busy time of year for DPS, and I'd like to thank my amazing colleagues from Education and Engagement for their assistance in the preparation of the event. I thank you all for making the time to come here. Please be aware of the schedule of events that roll out. So if you have registered on Eventbrite, you will get notified of our upcoming events. So please come along to those. A couple of things before I let you go. You've registered, you will get a survey emailed to you as a follow-up. We would really love your feedback through that mechanism. And finally, thank you again for coming along. I wish you all good night, and I hope the trains are working to get you home.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you.
All the best.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks,
Well
Miles.
done. Hey, you could make an MP out of you.
So,
Special Minister.
20 years in front of a school class that teaches you to be a politician.
Yeah. Much more civil environment as well.